We're going to get ready to install the pistons in this 302. So we need a few things. We need oil and a tub of oil. That's what's in the blue container. We need the rings, of course, a 1/4-inch drive ratchet and extension, the ring expander, feeder gauges, and of course the piston. It's a good idea to look at the instruction sheet that comes with the piston ring set. And it shows you the rings and the various way they go up, and point to the top of the piston or point to the bottom, and how to put the rings in. You can see this ring has a dot on it, and that means it goes to the top. The box that contains the rings, and these are 30 over rings. They were ordered special because we had determined that in the assessment. Tells you which is the top groove for the compression rings and the second groove. The top groove is important because it's got graphite in the ring, because it's like a fire stopper. It gets the immediate combustion pressure and heat. So it is a special ring, and it has to be put in properly. We're going to measure ring gap, and we're going to put the ring in carefully with the gap at the top, and then carefully push it in without scraping the honed cylinder walls, and then push it in with the piston upside down so that it becomes parallel. So we push it in down halfway through its travel very carefully, and don't force. And then we're going to take you can see it in place there. You can see the gap right at the very top, and you can see the journal at the bottom. Then we're going to take our feeder gauges and measure that gap, and that gap should be around 3 to 5.5 thousandths per inch of bore, and we found that the ring gap in this set of pistons was 20 thousandths of an inch, which was right on. Once you've measured the gap, you don't want to scrape the side of the cylinder wall, so you turn the ring at an angle, and then take your hands and then compress it so the two ends are together. That makes it smaller, and then you just gently pull it out of the cylinder, knowing that that's a good ring, and then you put it back in the position in the box where it came from. Well, the first ring we're going to install is the oil control ring, and it's got an expander. So there'll be an expander, and then on the bottom of that will be a rail, and on top of it will be a rail. So we put it in the ring groove, and then we position it so it's over one of the piston skirts. You can make out the join there, and you got to make sure that's not overlapped. Notice how we've attached the piston and the vise. The piston head, or the piston itself, should be able to move, so it's not clamped at the skirt at the bottom. And now we're ready to put on the bottom rail. First, these spiral rings on. So we've put the bottom rail in and are in the process of in a spiral motion, placing it in carefully into the bottom of the ring expander. You carefully place the bottom rail with your fingers, try not to scratch the piston, so it's secure in the bottom of the expander. And then you do the same thing for the top rail. So in the end, you have rail, the expander, and the bottom rail. To sum up, you have the expander rail gap over a piston skirt. You can see it there to the left. You have the bottom rail over one piston pin, and the top rail gap over the other piston pin. And that ring should be free to move sort of around the groove in a unit. So because it's clean and there's no grit in there, it should be able to do that quite easily. And we finished with the oil control ring unit. The compression rings are installed in a similar fashion. Check the box, make sure you got the second compression ring, or the middle ring, making sure it's the right side up, and you carefully spiral that ring in. It's the most difficult ring because you've got to go down farther into the middle ring, but you do not force it or it's brittle, it will snap. You continue this process, the spiraling of the ring, but very carefully. And when the end of the ring is ready to go in its final position, make sure it doesn't scrape down the ring lands and damage the piston. The top ring will be much easier to put on. When selecting the top ring, consult the box again, be sure what you got. The top ring on this set has a dot at the top, you can see it in the picture. And also we've checked the profile at the end of the ring, and this one's rectangular. So there's no bevels or whatever, as you see in the instructions. So we're correct to select this ring, and as I said before, it goes on the piston quite easily, and you'll find that you have to pull the end of the ring so it doesn't scrape the lands again, but it again is much easier. Now that we've got all the rings on, we want to make sure the gaps, the ring gaps, are in the correct position. So the bottom rail will be over one piston pin end. The expander gap will be over a piston skirt. The top rail will be over the opposite piston pin end. The second compression ring will be over the first or the bottom rail, same as the bottom rail, so we now staggered. And the top compression ring will be over the opposite of the second compression ring, so 180 degree movement for the top compression rings. Then we're going to see that all the rings are free to move in their ring gaps, so that there's no grit that's got in there or a piece of aluminum, and make sure they're all free, and we've completed installing the rings. Now the rings are all installed, we've got to get ready to install the piston in the cylinder. So we get the connecting rod bearings out and check them, make sure they're the 10,000s under, and install them in the connecting rod half of the bore of the bearing bore with the tab in place, and also in the connecting rod cap, making sure everything is absolutely clean. We've taken off the attaching nuts, and we're only doing one piston at a time. We're going to grease the cylinders on the thrust faces, that's as you see in the picture, that side, and then opposite we're going to put white bearing grease or white assembly grease so initial startup it's got some lubrication. We have put the piston and the new rings and whatnot upside down in that tub of oil that you saw at the beginning of the voiceover, and put it back in the vise, making sure we do not clamp on the piston. Notice it's sort of sideways a little bit, so that when we tighten the vise that we're not clamping the piston. So that's completely oil soaked, so is the piston pin area. And then we're going to obtain our 1/4 inch drive ratchet and extension, and the piston ring compressor. And notice there's an up and a down here. There's little tabs at the bottom, that's the down, and that'll go against the block. And we're getting ready to compress the ring so we can install the piston. We've compressed the rings, and you can see the little tabs a little bit more clearly that are down, so they'll go against the block. We haven't over tightened the ring compressor, and we've made sure that we haven't caught any of the rings that have been a little bit out of their ring groove, and we've carefully tightened this ring compressor. You tighten it by you can see here in this picture, just by that at the bottom left, a 1/4 inch drive extension and ratchet will fit in that bottom left, and you turn it clockwise to compress. Now we're gently putting the position into the cylinder with the skirts in the right position and the groover or positioning dot on the piston head pointed toward the front of the engine. We made sure it's number 1 piston into number 1 cylinder, and we push it right up so that the ring compressor is touching the block, and also we put rubber hose on the connecting rod studs so that they do not damage the crank, but we're careful about not jamming anything. Now we're just leveling off the ring compressor so it's flush against the block, and we gently tap in with a hammer hand or a piece of wood, tap the piston head into the cylinder, and we do not force this. If it catches, we secure the ring compressor, but it should go in, and making sure that the ends of the connecting rod caps are going over the journal. And we continue this process again gently, and until the piston is all the way in. Soon the compressor will have done its job, and we're going to push the piston right in so that the connecting rod is secure against the journal, the connecting rod journal. Once it's all the way in, we install the connecting rod cap. Note the number ones that are not only they going together, but they're on the outside of the block, and that's, if you remember on disassembly, we noted that. So we put the cap on, and we're going to get prepared to torque it. So we torque it to specifications, which in this engine we looked up previously and have a list of these torque specifications. So we torque one nut and then the other nut, and very carefully and listening for the click and not to over tighten. Once it's torqued, you can see the bearing grease, the assembly grease that's been put on the bearing before we installed it. If I didn't mention that, it's mentioned now. And we also see if we can move the connecting rod and bearing back and forth a little bit. That tells us it's not too tight. And we look for any movement because we're always kind of checking for anything that's a mistake either by the supplier or by the technician. And this one is just great. You continue this process until all of this side of the V8 is done, and then you'd flip it around and do the other side. And remember, after every piston, rotate the engine once, and that again is a check just in case something is in backwards or there is a problem. It should turn reasonably freely and turn it one revolution, and then get the next piston crankshaft journal down to bottom dead center for installation. So thank you very much.